The clock ticked past midnight, silence hanging heavy in the air as Alec Westbrook lay in his luxurious bed, his breath slow and even. But beneath the calm, a storm was brewing. Alec, a man used to controlling everything in his life, had never been more vulnerable. Hidden under the guise of sleep, his eyes barely closed, watching. A maid, hired just days ago, moved softly through the room, unaware of the game Alec had set in motion. Little did she know, every step she took was being observed, by a man who believed that trust only existed when no one was looking. What would Sophie do, with the weight of Alec's test hanging over her? And more importantly, what would Alec discover about himself when he least expected it? Tell us where you're watching from, and hit subscribe for more love stories where duty and desire collide. Alec Westbrook, the CEO of one of the most successful companies in the world, had made a career out of seeing through people, reading their every move. But for all his wealth and influence, he was haunted by a single undeniable truth. He trusted no one. Every person around him, from employees to lovers, seemed to want something that Alec could never shake off. Enter Sophie, a maid with a calm composure that intrigued Alec from the moment she walked through his mansion's doors. She wasn't like the others. There was something different about her, something that Alec couldn't quite place. Was it the way she moved, the quiet grace with which she performed her duties? Or was it her eyes? Those eyes that never quite seemed to look at him like everyone else did, like a man who could be bought. But Alec wasn't one to leave anything to chance. He decided to test Sophie in the most subtle of ways. He would pretend to sleep, let her think she was alone, and watch her every move. In his mind, this would prove her loyalty. But Alec's plan backfired. Sophie's actions, so simple and genuine, shattered his expectations, forcing him to confront something much deeper than he was ready for. Her every move made him question his own values, his control, his trust, and his heart. Was he being played? Or was he seeing something in Sophie that had eluded him for years? What happens next will force Alec to look beyond the walls of power he has so carefully constructed around himself. Can Sophie truly be trusted? Or is this just another game for her too? As the days passed and Alec's mind became consumed with Sophie's every gesture, every decision, he couldn't help but wonder, who was she really? He had seen too many people use their charm to manipulate him. But Sophie was different. There was an undeniable truth in her actions. Alec knew the time had come to learn more about the woman who had unwittingly unraveled the fortress he had built around his heart. What he discovered about her past, and the reason why she had come to work for him in the first place, would change everything Alec thought he knew about trust. Alec couldn't help but wonder, who was Sophie really? And why did she seem so different from everyone else he had known? As the days passed, he found himself drawn to her, not just as a maid, but as someone with a depth he hadn't anticipated. The real test was no longer whether she would betray him. It was whether he could open his heart to someone who had, in just a few days, begun to challenge everything he believed about trust. Alec's mind buzzed with thoughts as he lay still in the dimly lit room, pretending to sleep. Sophie moved quietly around the space, the soft swish of her footsteps the only sound that broke the silence. He had done this before, watched people to assess their character, but never had he felt so uncertain, so intrigued. As Sophie approached the desk to dust, Alec could see the delicate precision with which she handled each item. He'd expected her to take shortcuts, perhaps let things slide while he was unaware. But instead,
she worked with an intensity that exceeded his expectations. Every surface she touched gleamed with the kind of care that suggested real pride in her work, not just the diligence of someone fulfilling a contract. He noticed how she wiped down the edges of the desk, cleaning beneath the lamp, moving the small framed photo of his late parents to reach the dust behind it. In his years of hiring staff, Alec had never seen anyone go to such lengths to ensure everything was perfect, let alone someone who was supposed to be invisible in the background of his mansion. The movements were smooth, deliberate, and almost graceful. Nothing about Sophie suggested the behavior of a mere servant. She moved across the room, her eyes catching the faint glint of moonlight, revealing a subtle determination etched into her face. Alec's eyes narrowed as he followed her every move, a tinge of confusion mixing with the usual control he was so comfortable wielding. This was not how he envisioned the test playing out. He had expected Sophie to falter in some way. It was what he did to people, always waiting for them to show their flaws, to prove they weren't trustworthy. But she was exceeding all of his expectations. A soft sigh escaped his lips, but Sophie didn't flinch. She didn't pause, didn't glance over at him as though she sensed him watching. She merely continued, even taking the time to straighten the chair he'd left askew earlier. Every movement spoke of a sense of responsibility that Alec wasn't used to seeing in others, especially in someone hired to simply clean his house. She was meticulous, attentive, and calm. There was a sharpness to her that went beyond her duties, a kind of quiet professionalism that he could neither ignore nor explain. But what truly caught his attention wasn't just her carefulness. It was the quiet kindness with which she carried herself. Alec had assumed that people only did good deeds to get something in return. People like Sophie, who had nothing to lose in his world of power and privilege, were supposed to be self-interested. They didn't help for the sake of helping. They did what they were told, and nothing more. Yet Sophie went beyond that. She glanced over at the kitchen counter, noticing a small pile of dishes left from the last meal he had taken. Without hesitation, she walked over and began to wash them, scrubbing the plates with methodical care. Alec had never told her to do that. It wasn't part of her job description. But there she was, ensuring that everything was in order, even when no one was watching. As he lay there, unable to turn away, he felt something stir within him, an odd mix of admiration and curiosity. What drove her? What made her work so tirelessly, even in the absence of any immediate reward? Alec's gaze followed her as she moved with silent efficiency, organizing the kitchen cabinets, even wiping down the windowsill. She cleaned in corners that he had long since neglected. A nagging thought wormed its way into his mind. Sophie wasn't just doing her job. She was going above and beyond, not for him, but because that was who she was. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. What was it about Sophie that made him question everything? Alec's perception of her had shifted in those brief moments. He'd assumed she was like everyone else, a means to an end, someone to fill a position and remain in the background. But Sophie had proven him wrong at every turn. She didn't seem to want anything from him, and that was a rarity in Alec's world. No one ever did anything without an ulterior motive. His whole life had been built on this principle, until now. And then it hit him. Sophie wasn't just performing tasks, she was elevating them. She didn't need to impress him. She was impressive on her own. His mind raced as he tried to decipher her motivations. Was she truly as perfect as she seemed? Or was this all a clever ruse to gain his trust? Was she playing him, just as he had played so many others before? Alec had always prided himself on being able to read people, But Sophie was different. The longer he observed her, the more confused he became. She had so much depth, too much to just be a maid in his house. She had talent, intelligence, and a grace that transcended her position. Alec wanted answers, and he wanted them now. His curiosity deepened, mingling with something else, something he couldn't quite place. It was unsettling, this feeling of being out of control. The air around him seemed heavier, as though the silence in the room had grown thicker, more intense. Was he truly seeing Sophie for who she was? Or was he only projecting what he wanted her to be? Was he the one being tested, rather than Sophie? The silence was broken when Sophie paused for just a moment, her gaze shifting ever so slightly toward his direction. Her lips curled up into a faint smile, almost as if she knew exactly what he was thinking, even without speaking a word. Alec's breath caught in his throat. Could she possibly have known he was watching? Had she seen through him, just as he had tried to see through her? Before he could come to any conclusions, Sophie quietly placed the final dish in the rack and moved to finish the rest of her chores, her expression unreadable. Alec lay still, the weight of her actions pressing down on him. He could no longer deny it. There was something about Sophie that intrigued him beyond measure. She was more than he had bargained for. Now, the question lingered in his mind. Who was she really? What had led her to this life? And what was she hiding behind that calm, serene facade? Alec had to know. And he would find out, no matter what it took. Alec's mind raced, but one thing was clear. Sophie had become more than just a maid. She was someone who had the power to change everything he thought he knew about people, trust, and loyalty. And Alec was determined to uncover her secrets, no matter the cost. Alec's gaze never left Sophie as she moved gracefully around the mansion, tidying up and tending to the smallest of details with precision. He had thought he'd seen it all in his years of business, from ruthless executives to manipulative socialites. But Sophie was different. She was composed, skilled, and strangely attuned to the world around her. In a way, she made Alec feel like he was the one who was being observed. It wasn't until the smell of smoke began to creep through the house that Alec's perception of her would change again. This time, in a way he never expected. The first sign came when he noticed the faint odor wafting from the kitchen. It was sharp, unmistakable. Alec had been in the study, but his instincts kicked in and he stood up, his senses heightened. He knew something was wrong. Within moments, Sophie appeared in the doorway of his study, her calm face betraying no hint of panic. "Mr. Westbrook, there's a fire in the kitchen. Please stay back." Alec was momentarily stunned. A fire? At this hour? His first instinct was to grab the phone and call for the fire department, but Sophie was already moving with an urgency that suggested she had everything under control. "Stay here," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'll take care of it." Before Alec could protest, Sophie was already out of the room, disappearing down the hallway. Alec's heart raced, but something in Sophie's demeanor, her calm, her focus, told him to trust her. He had been watching her for days, observing how she handled everything with a quiet determination, but he had never seen her like this. There was an intensity in her movements now, a certainty that caught him off guard. He waited, torn between the instinct to intervene and the strange feeling that Sophie knew exactly what she was doing. He stood still for what felt like an eternity, each second pulling him closer to the edge of his comfort zone. What was happening in that kitchen? Was Sophie really capable of handling this on her own? The sound of crackling flames broke the silence, followed by the unmistakable hiss of fire fighting the water from the kitchen sink. Alec's breath caught in his throat. Without thinking, he rushed toward the source of the chaos. He rounded the corner just in time to see Sophie standing with her back to the stove, the flames licking at the ceiling. She didn't seem fazed. Her hands moved in a steady rhythm, pulling the pan from the stove and quickly dousing the fire with a fire extinguisher she had apparently already retrieved from under the sink. The fire hissed and sputtered before it was snuffed out entirely. Alec stood frozen in place, stunned. The woman who had been so composed while dusting the shelves just hours ago was now battling a fire with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He watched as Sophie calmly stepped back, her movements deliberate, her expression one of quiet resolve. The kitchen was thick with the smell of burnt food and extinguishing chemicals, but Sophie remained unfazed. She wiped her hands on a towel, her face impassive as if she had handled this situation 1,000 times before. Alec's heart pounded in his chest as he took in the scene. There was no panic, no hesitation. Sophie had saved the mansion and, more importantly, had saved him from a potential disaster. He hadn't even had the chance to react, and yet she had been the one to control the situation with ease. Sophie turned and met his gaze, her eyes cool but focused. "It's under control now," she said simply, as if it were no more significant than any other task she'd done that day. Alec swallowed hard, feeling both awe and disbelief bubbling up inside him. He had always believed that those who worked in his home were nothing more than employees, playing their parts in the background. He never imagined that one of them could be capable of something like this. She wasn't just a maid. She was something far more impressive, a woman who could think on her feet, stay calm under pressure, and handle a crisis with an efficiency that Alec had never seen in anyone else. Alec felt a wave of confusion wash over him. How could someone like Sophie, someone with this kind of intelligence and resourcefulness, be working as a maid in his mansion? There had to be more to her story, more to her than what she had allowed him to see. As he stood there, staring at Sophie, he realized just how little he knew about her. She had shown him nothing but kindness and dedication since the moment she arrived, but this was different. This was a glimpse of something deeper, something he hadn't expected. The implications were unsettling. Sophie had a mind capable of handling far more than household duties. Alec couldn't deny the admiration that was building inside him. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something, something that, if revealed, might shake the very foundation of everything he believed about her. He had to know more. Alec watched as Sophie cleaned up the last remnants of the mess with the same quiet precision she always exhibited. But this time, Alec didn't just see a maid at work. He saw someone capable of much more than what she let on. Someone who had just changed his perception of her completely. Alec felt an unfamiliar unease settle in his chest. He had always been in control of his business, his life, and the people in it. But Sophie was different. She had just proven that she could handle any crisis thrown her way. What kind of woman had he hired? And what exactly had led her to take a job like this when she clearly had the talent and intelligence to do so much more? As he watched her work, the questions lingered in his mind. Sophie had just stepped out of the shadows in a way Alec had never expected. But what was she hiding beneath the calm exterior? And why had she chosen this life? The answers, Alec knew, were far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. Alec couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest after the fire. The calm, collected way Sophie handled the situation had unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just a maid. She was something much more. There was no denying that now. The image he had formed of her, quiet, unassuming, and obedient, had shattered, replaced by a woman who was resourceful, intelligent, and capable of managing chaos with a level of calm he could barely fathom. His curiosity, already piqued, began to gnaw at him. What was it about Sophie that made her so different from everyone else in his life? She wasn't just handling the job, she was thriving in it. But Alec had a hard time believing that a woman with so much skill and grace would settle for a life as a maid.
Something about that didn't add up. Unable to let go of the questions that lingered in his mind, Alec decided to investigate. It wasn't like him to be so intrigued by someone's backstory, but Sophie was no ordinary employee. Her composed exterior didn't match the unspoken depths he sensed beneath. Alec knew that if he wanted to understand her better, he had to dig a little deeper. His first step was to look into her background. It didn't take long for Alec to uncover details that stunned him. Sophie wasn't from a humble background. In fact, she came from one of the wealthiest families in the city. Her parents were prominent figures in high society, with connections in the elite circles Alec frequented, though he'd never heard of them directly. Sophie's life had been one of privilege, private tutors, expensive vacations, and a lifestyle that many would envy. Yet, here she was, working as a maid in his mansion, living under a completely different name. Alec's mind raced as he pieced together what he had learned. Sophie's decision to leave her privileged life behind and take up a job in a world so far removed from her upbringing baffled him.
It wasn't as if she needed the money. She could have lived comfortably for the rest of her life. So why had she chosen this? Why had she abandoned the wealth and status she was born into for a life of anonymity and hard work? As the days passed, Alec couldn't stop thinking about it. There had to be a reason, a deep-rooted motivation for Sophie's decision. He decided to confront her, to ask the question that had been haunting him since he first discovered her secret past. But he needed to be careful. Sophie was not someone who gave away her truths easily. One evening, as they both stood in the kitchen, Alec reviewing some business papers and Sophie cleaning up after dinner, the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Alec glanced up, catching her as she dried the dishes with steady hands. He cleared his throat, deciding to take the plunge. "You've been here a while now, Sophie," Alec began, his tone casual but probing. "And I've been thinking a lot about your background." Sophie paused, her fingers lingering on the edge of a plate before setting it down on the counter. She didn't look at him directly, but kept her gaze steady, as if she had been expecting this conversation to come eventually. "I'm sure you have," she replied, her voice neutral, almost too calm. She wasn't surprised by his question. If anything, Alec realized, she had been waiting for him to ask. Sophie had always been so composed, so collected. But now, there was a subtle shift in the air, a tension that Alec could almost feel. "I've been curious," he continued, his voice soft but firm. "You come from money, don't you? A life of privilege. So why here? Why this? Why leave all of that behind to work as a maid in a mansion?" The question hung between them like a fragile thread, ready to snap. Alec held his breath, waiting for her response. Sophie met his gaze then, her blue eyes clear and unflinching. A small smile played at the corners of her lips, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was something deeper, almost sad, like the remnants of a past she had tried to bury. "I left," she said softly, her voice steady, "because that life wasn't for me. I wanted something real, something meaningful, not just a collection of empty luxuries. The expectations, the image, the endless pressure to be something I wasn't. It suffocated me." Alec's mind raced as he listened. He had assumed Sophie's story would involve rebellion, maybe anger, a desire to escape the suffocating life of wealth. But her words weren't laced with bitterness. There was no anger, just a quiet acceptance of a choice she had made. "I didn't want to be defined by my family or my money," Sophie continued, her gaze drifting to the window. "I wanted to live authentically, to do something that felt real, where I could be valued for who I am, not for what I have or who I know." Alec felt a strange pang in his chest. He understood the weight of expectations. He had his own share of them, though they came from different sources. But to hear Sophie speak with such conviction, to hear her articulate the desire to live on her own terms, was something he couldn't relate to. Alec had been born into his world of wealth and control, and he had spent years building his empire. The idea of stepping away from that, to leave behind everything he had worked for, felt alien to him. But as he stood there, listening to Sophie's quiet revelation, Alec couldn't help but admire her courage. It took a kind of bravery to leave behind everything that was expected of you and start fresh, even when you had everything at your disposal. "You've got guts," Alec said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Most people would never dream of leaving everything behind for something uncertain." Sophie glanced up at him then, her eyes softening ever so slightly. "Sometimes it's the uncertainty that makes life worth living," she replied, her voice tinged with something Alec couldn't quite place. Hope, maybe, or a kind of peace. Alec's admiration for Sophie deepened, but so did his confusion. The more he learned about her, the more questions arose. Sophie wasn't just some high society runaway. She was a woman who had made a conscious choice to give up everything most people would kill to have. And the question still lingered in his mind. Why had she chosen this life? Alec's thoughts spiraled as he looked at Sophie, her quiet resolve almost too much to bear. There was so much he didn't know about her, so much she had kept hidden. But one thing was clear. Sophie wasn't just a maid in his house. She was a woman with a past that still had its hold on her. And Alec couldn't help but wonder, would Sophie's secrets be the thing that ultimately pulled them together, or the one that tore them apart? Alec Westbrook had built an empire. From the outside, it was flawless. Everything he had worked for was on display. The massive mansion, the luxury cars, the success that made everyone around him bow to his influence. But beneath the polished surface there was a cavernous emptiness that he couldn't shake, a void that only seemed to grow wider as the days passed. The truth was, Alec felt alone. Surrounded by people who wanted his wealth, his power, or his connections, Alec had long stopped trusting anyone who wasn't tied to him by the smallest of transactions. Relationships were no longer real to him. They were deals, transactions. He had become skilled at using others to get what he wanted. But somewhere along the way he lost the ability to connect with anyone beyond what they could give him. He had spent years building walls around himself, so high and so thick that even he had forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable. He had been too careful, too controlling, making sure that no one could ever breach the fortress he had constructed around his heart. That was until Sophie. As he sat in the study, the dim light of the evening sun casting a warm glow over the room, Alec found himself lost in thought. Sophie had just finished tidying the kitchen and was now taking a break in the hallway. He had been observing her for days, watching how she worked with such dedication. And yet today, something was different. He felt something stirring inside him, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. She was a woman who had chosen to walk away from a life of luxury. She had left behind a world that so many people would have died to be a part of. And in doing so, she had shown him a kind of strength he had never known. Sophie had done something Alec could never fathom. She had given up wealth, status, and comfort for something deeper, something more meaningful. And in the process, she had become the one person who made him question everything. Alec had never opened up to anyone. Not really. Not about the things that scared him, not about the loneliness he lived with every day. But in Sophie's presence, something inside him began to crack. He couldn't explain it, but he found himself wanting to talk to her, to let her see beyond the walls he had spent so long constructing. "Sophie," Alec began, his voice hesitant but steady. She had been standing at the end of the hallway,
looking out of the window, but now she turned to face him. There was a quiet understanding in her gaze, something that seemed to draw him in. She had always been so calm, so composed. It was as though she had seen the world for what it was and accepted it without hesitation. And that made her different from anyone else he had known. I've spent my whole life building things. Businesses, relationships, control, Alec continued, his words slow, deliberate. But I've never really felt connected to anyone. Not really. People only come to me because of what I have. They want my money, my connections, my power. It's all about what I can give them. Sophie's eyes softened as she took a step toward him. She said nothing,
But her presence was enough. Alec could see the empathy in her eyes, and for a moment he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was foreign to him. I've used people to get what I wanted, Alec admitted, his voice tight with emotion. But I'm empty. I don't know how to fix it. Every relationship has been a transaction. I've never really trusted anyone. Until you. Sophie took another step forward, her hand resting lightly on the armrest of the chair he sat in. She didn't speak immediately, just allowed the weight of his words to settle in the air between them. You've built this empire, Sophie said gently, her voice carrying the weight of her own experience. But at what cost? What's the point of having all of this if it doesn't bring you the connection you need? Alec's chest tightened at the honesty in her words. He had spent so many years convincing himself that his wealth, his control, were the answers to everything. But Sophie was right. What was the point if it left him alone? What had he gained if he couldn't trust anyone? If he couldn't let anyone in? I don't know, Alec murmured, his voice a raw whisper. I thought I was doing it for myself. But now I'm not so sure. Sophie's gaze never wavered, and for the first time Alec felt like he was being seen. Not as the powerful CEO, not as the man who controlled everything, but as a person who was struggling. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. He felt a connection to Sophie that he hadn't felt with anyone in years. She knelt down in front of him, her eyes meeting his with quiet determination. Alec, she said softly, you don't have to keep hiding behind this wall you've built. You've done amazing things, but there's more to life than control and power. It's about the people who see you, not for what you have, but for who you are. Alec swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing. And who am I, Sophie? His voice was barely audible. Who am I if I let go of everything I've worked for? Sophie placed her hand gently on his. You're a man who's ready to see the world differently, she said, her words slow and measured. You're someone who deserves to feel loved, not because of what you can give, but because of who you are inside. You're more than just your wealth, Alec. Her words were a balm to a wound he hadn't realized was so deep. Alec felt something stir within him, something raw and real. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was just playing a part in a game. He felt seen. Alec looked at Sophie, the woman who had opened his eyes to everything he had been avoiding. He hadn't expected to feel this way. He hadn't expected to care. Sophie, Alec began, his voice trembling, I think I've fallen for you. Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place, a mixture of surprise and caution. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down as though weighing the gravity of his words. Alec's heart raced, uncertainty creeping in. Sophie's gaze flickered up, and Alec could see the hesitation in her eyes. Alec, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not sure if I can let myself feel the same. Not yet. Alec felt his chest tighten.
The tension between them was palpable, and he realized that, for all the walls he had built, Sophie had her own walls to protect her. And now, he wasn't sure if they could ever truly tear them down. The evening had settled into a quiet stillness, with the faint hum of the city just beyond the mansion's walls. Alec found himself in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his thoughts swirling in a way that felt as tumultuous as the storm outside. The tension between him and Sophie had been building for days, each shared glance, each conversation, slowly unraveling the walls Alec had worked so hard to build. But despite the connection they shared,
There was always something between them, something that Sophie kept guarded, something he couldn't quite reach. Alec's mind wandered back to their earlier conversation, the one where he had confessed his feelings for her. The words had spilled out before he could stop them, raw and unfiltered. Sophie's response had been measured, distant. He couldn't deny that she cared for him, but she kept herself at arm's length, reluctant to let down the walls she had built around her heart. And that only made Alec want to know her more, to understand what it was that held her back. Tonight, however, Sophie had returned to the study, her footsteps light against the polished floors. She stood at the door, her figure framed by the dim light from the hallway. Alec looked up, his gaze catching hers. There was something different about her tonight, something in the way she stood there, hesitant, yet determined. "Can we talk?" Sophie asked, her voice soft, almost too quiet. Alec set the glass down on the desk, his attention fully on her. "Of course. Come in." Sophie stepped inside, closing the door behind her. There was a strange energy between them, a quiet tension that Alec couldn't quite place. He watched her, waiting for her to speak, but it was Sophie who broke the silence first. "I knew," she said, her words hanging in the air like a delicate thread. Alec's brows furrowed in confusion. "Knew what?" She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving his. "I knew you were testing me." Alec's heart skipped a beat, the words hitting him harder than he expected. He had been so careful, so calculated in his observations, believing he was the one in control. But here Sophie was, standing before him, revealing that she had seen through his manipulations from the start. "You knew?" Alec repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie nodded, her expression calm, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even compassion. "I could tell from the way you watched me, from the way you acted like you were asleep, but I could feel your eyes on me. I wasn't sure at first, but then I realized you were testing me, seeing if I would take advantage of your trust, or if I would fall into the trap of using you for my own gain." Alec stood still, stunned by the insight she had into his character. He had underestimated Sophie, thought her too simple, too naive to catch on to his secret. But she had known all along. And not only had she known, but she had chosen to do the one thing he had never expected. She had played his game, but on her own terms. "You weren't angry?" Alec asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You didn't resent me for testing you?" Sophie shook her head. "No. I understood why you did it. You've been hurt before, and you don't trust easily. But I decided not to play the game your way. Instead, I chose to prove you wrong. I wanted to show you that not everyone is out for personal gain. That some people, like me, are just trying to do their best, to be genuine." Alec's mind reeled. He had assumed that Sophie, like everyone else, would fall into the trap of wanting something from him. But she had turned the tables, offering him something he hadn't known he was missing. Authenticity, honesty, and perhaps the one thing he had always feared. Vulnerability. He stared at her, trying to process what she had said. You didn't resent me for it?" he repeated, needing to hear it again. Sophie smiled faintly, but there was a sadness behind her eyes, as if she had seen more than she was letting on. No, I didn't resent you. I just wanted to show you that I'm not like everyone else. Alec felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, admiration, and even a sense of shame. He had been so caught up in his own fears, his own insecurities, that he hadn't stopped to consider how his actions might have affected Sophie. He had been testing her, yes, but in doing so, he had also been testing himself, questioning whether anyone could ever see past his wealth and his walls. But Sophie had passed the test in a way Alec hadn't expected. She hadn't fought back, hadn't lashed out in anger. Instead, she had taken the higher road, choosing to show him her true self rather than play into his doubts. I never meant to hurt you, Alec confessed, his voice raw. I don't know how to trust anyone. I've spent my life keeping people at a distance, using them to get what I want. But with you... His voice trailed off, the words failing him. Sophie stepped closer, her presence calm but undeniable. I know, she said softly. But trust isn't something that can be earned through tests. It's built over time, through honesty, vulnerability, and connection. Alec looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had spent his life building his empire. But in doing so, he had built walls around his heart, walls that now seemed too high to climb. Sophie, however, had been the first person to make him question those walls, to make him wonder if perhaps there was something more to life than power and control. As the silence stretched between them, Alec realized just how much Sophie had changed him. She had shown him a side of himself he hadn't even known existed, one that was capable of connection, of trust, and perhaps even of love. But as Alec opened himself up to the possibility of vulnerability, he couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was still holding something back. Despite her honesty, despite her openness, there was a part of her that remained guarded, a part of her that Alec couldn't reach. And in that moment, Alec realized something. Sophie had her own walls to protect, and no matter how much he wanted to break through them, it wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. The night had fallen quietly around the mansion, but inside Alec's study, the tension was palpable. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as Alec prepared to finally confront Sophie. He had been holding this moment in for days, his thoughts spinning in endless circles, but now there was no avoiding it. The weight of his actions, the test, the manipulation, pressed down on him with an intensity that was both suffocating and liberating. Sophie had been in the kitchen, her hands moving with the same precision that had come to define her. Alec had watched her from a distance, a part of him still unable to fully grasp the woman who had taken his carefully constructed world and shaken it apart. She was different, too different, and yet it was exactly what he needed. But that didn't change the fact that he had deceived her, and it was time to face the truth. He had waited until she returned to the study, her steps light but resolute, before he spoke. "Sophie," Alec began, his voice calm but with an underlying tension. "I need to tell you something." Sophie looked at him, her eyes soft yet guarded. She had an air of quiet understanding, as if she knew exactly what was coming. For a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken agreement. "I've been testing you," Alec said, his words heavy, as if the truth was finally forcing its way out. "I pretended to sleep so I could see how you'd act, to see if you'd take advantage of my trust, or if you'd betray me." Sophie didn't flinch. She didn't react with anger, didn't show any sign of hurt. She simply stood there, her expression serene, and listened. Alec's chest tightened. He had expected her to be angry, to confront him with a barrage of questions, maybe even a sharp accusation. But Sophie wasn't like anyone he had ever met. She didn't meet his manipulations with the same energy. Instead, she responded with the calm dignity
that had become her signature. "I know," she said softly, her voice steady, as if she had been expecting this moment for days, if not longer. Alec's breath caught.
"You knew?"
Sophie nodded. "I could tell from the way you were watching me. I didn't need to be a detective to figure it out. You wanted to see if I'd take advantage of your vulnerability. But I didn't. I chose not to." Alec's mind raced as he absorbed her words. He had underestimated her, assumed that she would fall into the trap he had set. But Sophie wasn't playing by his rules. She was playing by her own, and in doing so, had risen above the game he had tried to trap her in. "You didn't resent me for it?" Alec asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie's gaze softened. "No. I understood why you did it. I get it, Alec. You don't trust easily. The world's given you plenty of reasons to doubt people. But I didn't want to play that game. I wanted to show you that not everyone is out for personal gain." Her words hit Alec harder than he anticipated. They were simple, but they carried a weight he hadn't been prepared for. The realization that Sophie had not only seen through him, but had chosen to act with integrity despite his manipulation, struck him to his core. In that moment, Alec understood just how much he had misjudged her, and how much he had yet to learn about trust. "I was wrong," Alec said, the admission falling from his lips before he could stop it. "I've spent my whole life pushing people away, using them as tools, thinking that if I could control everything, I could avoid being hurt. But all I've done is made myself more alone." Sophie's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him, her presence a calm reassurance. "You're not alone, Alec. You're just afraid. But trust and love, they don't come from control. They come from understanding, from letting go of the fear that people will betray you, and allowing yourself to trust them, flaws and all." Alec looked at her, his heart racing. For the first time, he felt seen. Not as the billionaire CEO, not as the powerful man everyone feared or admired, but as Alec. A man who had spent his life building walls to protect himself from the very thing he now wanted most: to be loved, to be trusted, to be understood. Sophie's words cut through the layers of his defenses, and Alec felt something shift inside him. It was a vulnerability he hadn't felt in years, and yet, in Sophie's presence, it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like freedom. "I want to be with you," Alec said, his voice hoarse, the words tumbling out with a sense of urgency he couldn't deny. "Not because of your beauty or intelligence, but because of the way you've made me see things differently. You've challenged everything I thought I knew about control, about trust, about myself. I don't want to live in fear anymore." Sophie stood still for a moment, her gaze never leaving his. Alec held his breath, waiting for her response. He had laid himself bare before her, had exposed the parts of himself he had kept hidden for so long. But now, as he waited for her to speak, there was a knot in his chest. Was she ready to take that leap with him? Or had he asked too much too soon? Sophie's lips parted, and for a moment Alec thought she was going to speak. But then the doorbell rang, interrupting the fragile moment between them. It was a loud, jarring sound that echoed through the quiet house, pulling them both out of the intimacy of the moment. Sophie stepped back, her expression guarded again. Alec's heart sank as she turned toward the door. Alec watched her, his mind reeling. Sophie was so close to opening up to him. And yet something still held her back. He could feel it in the way she hesitated, the way her walls rose up just as quickly as they had come down. Sophie paused, her hand resting on the door handle, her back still turned to him. "Alec?" she said, her voice quiet but filled with an uncertainty he hadn't heard before. "I can't promise you anything right now. Not yet. But
but I'm not running away from you either. She opened the door, her figure retreating from him once more. Alec stood there, his heart pounding, torn between the hope she had given him and the fear that she might never truly let him in. The evening had a certain stillness to it, the kind that only happened when the world was set aside for a brief, fleeting moment. Alec and Sophie sat across from each other at the table in his dining room, the candlelight flickering between them, casting shadows on their faces. It should have felt ordinary, even mundane, an evening between two people sharing a meal. But for Alec, it was anything but. Tonight, everything was different. It was the first time they had shared such an intimate moment, just the two of them, without the weight of the world pressing down on them. The soft clink of silverware against plates was the only sound in the room, each pause in the conversation heavier than the last. Alec found himself watching Sophie, the woman who had somehow turned his world upside down, her eyes flickering between the food on her plate and the candlelight as she moved the fork to her lips with a quiet grace. But there was something more in her eyes tonight, something vulnerable, something that mirrored the uncertainty he felt deep inside. Alec's thoughts were racing, but the words he had to say were ready now, more certain than ever. He set down his glass, his gaze locking with hers. "Sophie," he began, his voice steady yet laced with emotion, "I can't stop thinking about you. About us." She met his eyes, but there was a hint of hesitation in her gaze. Alec could see it in the way she stiffened, just slightly. She wasn't sure what he was about to say, and part of him couldn't blame her. After all, they had been through so much. He had tested her, manipulated her, pushed her to her limits, all while trying to protect himself from the one thing he had always feared: falling in love. "I've never felt like this before," he continued, his voice softening. "I've spent so much of my life controlling everything, but you—" He swallowed hard, the vulnerability in his words surprising him. "You've made me realize that I don't want to control anymore. I don't want to be alone. I've fallen for you, Sophie. I don't want to let you go." Sophie didn't speak at first. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, and for a moment Alec regretted everything. Had he rushed too quickly? Had he exposed too much of himself too soon? Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I care about you, Alec. I do." She paused, her eyes flickering to the side as if searching for the right words. "But—" Alec's heart dropped. He had feared this moment, feared the words that might come next. His hands tightened around his glass, but he didn't look away from her. Sophie exhaled slowly, and when she met his gaze again, her expression softened. "I can't let go of who I am. I've worked too hard to find myself, to be independent. I can't just give that up for anyone. Not for you, not for anyone." Her voice was firm, but there was an undeniable gentleness to it. Alec was silent for a long moment, digesting her words. He had expected this. She had always been independent, fiercely so, but hearing her say it so plainly, the way she refused to let anyone, even him, take away her autonomy, was both a blow and a revelation. Sophie wasn't asking for anything from him. She wasn't interested in being taken care of, in relying on anyone to give her a life. "I respect that," Alec said quietly, the weight of his words settling in the space between them. "I didn't want to take that away from you, Sophie. I never wanted you to feel like you had to give up who you are." She looked at him then, her gaze softening, but there was still a distance in her eyes, a hesitation he couldn't quite understand. "But I still want you in my life," Alec added, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show you that love and independence can exist side by side. I don't want to control you. I just want to be with you. I want us to be partners." Sophie's gaze faltered for a moment, her lips parting slightly, as if weighing his words. "I know you're offering me something, but I can't be someone's project, Alec. I'm not looking for someone to fix my life for me. I've worked too hard to get to this point to have someone step in and take over." Alec could feel the sting of her words, but there was no anger, no frustration in her tone. She was just being honest. Sophie had been independent for so long that the idea of someone else dictating her path was foreign to her, even if that someone was Alec. "Then let me help you reclaim what you've lost," Alec said, his voice determined. "I've built my empire. You have the potential to do the same. I'll offer you a leadership position in my company, Sophie. You can have the chance to build something of your own, to take the reins, to be your own person, but with the resources and support you deserve." Sophie's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't immediately respond. She didn't ask for anything, didn't want any handouts, and Alec knew that. He wasn't offering her this out of guilt. He was offering it because he wanted her to have the freedom to choose her own destiny, just as she had done by leaving her past behind. "I can't accept that," Sophie said, finally breaking the silence. "It's not that I don't appreciate the offer, but true happiness comes from making decisions for myself. I don't want to be dependent on anyone, not even you. I want to do this on my own terms." Alec's chest tightened. He had hoped that his offer would bring her closer to him, that it would prove his commitment to her and to the partnership he envisioned. But Sophie's refusal wasn't rejection. It was her truth, her independence. And as much as he longed to change her mind, Alec knew deep down that he had to respect her decision. "You're stronger than I'll ever be," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I admire you, Sophie, more than you'll ever know. I just want to be part of your life, however that looks." Sophie's eyes softened, and for the first time in their conversation, a small, genuine smile appeared on her face. "You already are, Alec. You just have to trust that we'll find our own way, without anyone losing themselves in the process." Alec nodded, the weight of her words settling over him like a gentle rain. She was right. They didn't need to control each other. They just needed to be there for one another. Sophie stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to do this, Alec. I need to build my own empire, my own legacy. But I'm not walking away from you. I just need time." Alec watched as she turned to leave, her back straight, her resolve as unyielding as ever. He could feel the truth of her words settling deep inside him, a challenge that neither of them could ignore. What came next for them was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Sophie was not going to let anything, least of all him, define her. And now Alec had to decide. Would he support her in building her own future, or would he walk away and continue his life without her? Sophie stood at the window of her small but bright office, staring out at the bustling city streets below. The space was modest, far from the opulence of Alec's mansion, but it was hers. Every inch of it reflected her choices, her independence. It was the beginning of something new, something that didn't come with the weight of expectations or the shadow of a past life she no longer wanted to be a part of. This was her creation, and for the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. Alec had kept his word. He had supported her in every way, from helping her find a space to providing the resources she needed to start her own business. But more than that, he had respected her decision, never once pressuring her to compromise her values or independence. She had set the terms, and Alec had followed. The trust they had built in their relationship had grown stronger, and now it was time for Sophie to prove that she could succeed on her own terms. The first few months had been a whirlwind of hard work, late nights, and small victories. Sophie had launched her own consultancy, focused on helping individuals and businesses find their true potential by aligning their passions with their careers. It was a far cry from the high society life she had once known, but it was hers, and it filled her with a sense of purpose that no amount of wealth or status ever could.
She had struggled at times, of course. The world of entrepreneurship was daunting, especially when she had to navigate the maze of contracts, finances, and networking on her own. But every challenge had been an opportunity for growth, and each success, no matter how small, reminded her that she was building something meaningful, something she could be proud of. Today was a milestone, her first big client meeting. She had spent the past few weeks preparing for it, and now, as she adjusted her jacket and checked her reflection one last time, she felt the familiar rush of excitement that came with any new challenge. But before she left, her phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Alec. "Good luck today, Sophie. I know you'll do great. Don't forget, I'm just a phone call away if you need anything." A small smile tugged at her lips as she read the message. Alec had become a steady presence in her life, offering guidance when needed, but never once trying to control her. His support had been invaluable, but he had also given her the space to learn and grow on her own. That balance, she'd come to realize, was one of the things that made their relationship unique. They were partners, not in the traditional sense, but in a way that allowed them both to be their true selves. Sophie took a deep breath, tucking her phone into her bag before heading out the door. As she walked to the meeting, her mind was clear. She knew that her path wasn't easy, and she would face many more challenges along the way. But this was her journey, and it was one she was ready to embrace fully. Alec watched Sophie from across the street as she stepped out of the building, her confidence radiating as she made her way down the sidewalk. His heart swelled with pride. He had seen her struggle, seen the moments of doubt and fear, but through it all, she had remained determined to carve out her own place in the world. And now, she was thriving. Alec had always been a man who believed in control. Control over his business, his life, and his relationships. But Sophie had shown him something he hadn't known he needed: the ability to let go, to trust, to give space for growth, not just in others, but in himself as well. Watching Sophie flourish in her own right had given Alec a new perspective on life. He had always been focused on building empires. But what good was an empire if it came at the cost of meaningful connection? His own journey had been one of self-discovery. He had spent years protecting himself with walls, convinced that if he controlled everything, he would never be hurt. But Sophie had opened his eyes to the power of vulnerability, of trusting someone enough to let them see the real you. And in doing so, she had shown him what it meant to love without ownership, to build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than control. He had always been a man who valued independence, but now, Alec was learning that independence didn't mean isolation. True independence came from the ability to stand beside someone as equals, to support each other's dreams and goals without compromising who you were. And that was what Alec and Sophie had built. A partnership rooted in trust, respect, and above all, love. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon,
Alec and Sophie sat together at a small bistro, enjoying a quiet dinner in the city. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses filled the air, but to Alec, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. He reached across the table, taking Sophie's hand in his. "You're doing amazing things, Sophie," Alec said, his voice warm with admiration. "I'm proud of you." Sophie smiled, squeezing his hand. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me the space to do this, Alec. You believed in me when I didn't know if I could believe in myself." Alec shook his head, his gaze tender. "No. You believed in yourself. I just gave you the support you needed. You're the one who did all the hard work." Sophie looked down at their hands, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had found something in Alec that she hadn't expected: a true partner. They had both been on separate journeys, seeking fulfillment in different ways. But now, they were walking the same path together, side by side. "It's funny," Sophie said, her voice thoughtful. "I used to think that happiness came from the things we could buy or the status we could achieve. But now, I see that true happiness comes from within, from the freedom to live life on your own terms." Alec's expression softened as he looked at her. "I think I've learned that too." As they finished their meal,
Alec and Sophie shared a quiet moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling between them like a shared secret. They had both changed in ways they hadn't anticipated, but what had started as a journey of self-discovery had led them to a place of mutual understanding and love. And while there would be more challenges ahead, Alec knew that they could face them together. They had learned the most important lesson of all, that love wasn't about control or possession. It was about connection, trust, and the willingness to stand together, no matter what came their way. As they walked out into the cool evening air, hand in hand, Alec felt a sense of peace he had never known before. But just as they turned the corner, a figure stepped out from the shadows, and Alec's stomach tightened. The past had a way of catching up, and Alec knew that their journey was far from over.